Dracula. The very mention of the name brings to mind things so evil, so fantastic, so degrading. You wonder if it isn't all a dream, a nightmare. But no, this is no dream. This is Dracula.
Welcome to 26 for 26, a series showcasing some of my favorite cultural touchstones that are celebrating an anniversary in 2026. I'm your host, Nick, and together we'll take a closer look at the movies, music, games, and other miscellaneous items and why we should be celebrating their milestone. As a warning, this series may contain swear words and may involve discussion of sensitive topics. Please listen at your own discretion. Today's episode: Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi and directed by Todd Browning, released nationwide on February 14th, 1931. And now, to begin the story of Dracula, we have to set the stage for the way the world was looking at the time. Between 1914 and 1918, pretty much all of the great Western superpowers went to war in a war that kind of shifted the face of battle forever. A transition out of a horse and saber cavalry charges and into the era of machine gun fire and trench warfare. Following that, the young men who survived the Great War, as it was called back then, came back home to a very rocky road with the, of course, infamous stock market crash of October 1928, otherwise known as the kickoff of the Great Depression. And a fledgling new industry is blossoming out in Hollywood, California, where several different companies are attempting to make a business out of making motion pictures. The hot new development of the 1920s is the sound on disc and sound on film revolution that lead to what the advertisements at the time called the talkies. Motion pictures that for the first time are accompanied by a soundtrack that is automatically synced to the video itself, and in some cases even fancier, including dialogue straight from the actors' mouths. Gone are the days of the interstitial title card and the live organist or piano player in theater playing the soundtrack along to your movie. The company in question for our topic today, Universal Studios, which was founded by Carl Laemmle, who was a German immigrant and had spent the better part of his adult life in America working as an accountant out in Chicago. In his mid-30s, decides that he wants more than to sit behind a desk and quits his job to become a businessman. While his original plan was to open retail locations, he decided instead, after viewing Nickelodeons, which, for those who are unaware of why the cartoon channel geared for kids has that name, was one of the early forms of visual media where patrons would pay a nickel to have to look into the little viewfinder of a device and have within it a short animation play before their eyes to delight and amaze. The advent and popularity of these Nickelodeons was the sort of beginning steps of this fledgling movie industry. So Carl Laemmle decides to start one of the first motion picture theaters in Chicago called the White Front on Milwaukee Avenue. He eventually makes enough money to coordinate with some of the other similarly budding film company owners of the time to collaborate and join forces into the Universal Film Manufacturing Company. And for all his hard work in doing the organization, Carl Laemmle assumed the role of president of the Universal Film Manufacturing Company. The conglomeration into the Universal Film Manufacturing Company occurs in 1912. In 1915, Laemmle opens what we know today as Universal Studios Hollywood on a 230-acre converted farm in the San Fernando Valley, just down the road from Hollywood. So the beginning of Universal Studios, they are making silent films, as is the style at the time. It is not until 1927's landmark feature film, The Jazz Singer, that the notion of a full-length feature film to be included with sound and dialogue would be the sort of standard. But once it is done by The Jazz Singer, that is now sort of the bar to beat. With that, the studio begins looking for cost-effective projects to turn into their next big film. Now, this fledgling industry does not take long to realize that to be cost-effective in making a movie, it's very handy if the story is already written for you and that you don't have to pay writers and wait for them to come up with lines and plot and all that. So very early on, this motion picture industry begins the work of adapting books and novels, generally ones that have already had some sort of stage play adaptation already made. And one such book of that nature comes across the desk of Universal Studios, and that is Bram Stoker's Dracula.
The original terrifying story of a maniac and a man who lived after death, lived on human blood, took the form of a vampire bat, and lured innocent girls to a fate truly worse than death.
When we discuss vampire lore, we have to go back to one of the critical texts. Certainly not by any means the first ever mention of vampires, but definitely one of the most famous and well-known in human history, and that is the book Dracula by Bram Stoker, which was first released in 1897. This is our first time seeing a vampire character who has all of the abilities that we associate pretty commonly with vampires today, whether that be the transformation into a bat. In this case, also, the other transformation options include a wolf, mist or elemental dust, a hypnotic gaze, the ability to wordlessly command the deeds and thoughts of mortal beings. We find out through Count Dracula's nemesis, the monster hunter Professor Abraham Van Helsing. And I'm just realizing that's kind of funny that the author gives his monster hunter character his first name, Bram being a short version of Abraham. So that's fun little self-insert there by Mr. Stoker. But yes, we do find out in the book that Van Helsing does have a strength of will that can resist the hypnotic allure of our Count Dracula. In the novel, we also get the common trope of the vampire's aversion to garlic, and that the only way to fully kill the vampire is to stake them with a wooden stake through the heart. Bram Stoker also delivered into the vampire lore some new and interesting powers, such as the need to be invited into one's home and the need to sleep on Earth from their homeland. The lack of reflection in mirrors is also an invention of Mr. Stoker, and that is not a folkloric inheritance of the vampire lore. The book is published in 1897, is very popular. The Universal Studios project is not the first group to think that this story is gonna make a heck of a motion picture. And actually a German filmmaker in the 1920s goes ahead and makes an unlicensed adaptation of the Dracula story that we all know as Nosferatu. Now, this is, as it was in 1922, a silent film starring Count Orloff, who varies a fair bit in terms of presentation of the vampire. This is a very sort of alien-looking figure with a sort of bulbous head and pointy ears and two very obvious fangs, as well as his long claw-like hands. Aside from the visual depiction being different, the plot points are largely the same. It is, in fact, sued by Bram Stoker's. Unfortunately, Bram Stoker does die before the film adaptations of his work are widely released. But his widow gets legal action involved and file a cease and desist against the screenings of Nosferatu because it is such a close and obvious copying of the Bram Stoker story. But seeing that the Nosferatu film did get a lot of attention, Carl Laemmle Jr., the son of the founder of Universal Pictures, is now the head of production at the studio in the late 1920s and decides that this vampire story business is actually going to be their next big hit. And he goes ahead and pays $40,000 for theatrical and film rights to the official Bram Stoker Dracula novel so that it can be a faithful adaptation, officially licensed TM. And now he has the fun task of trying to get this production together right after the stock market has crashed. Therefore, this process takes a couple of years. When the project is originally conceived of, the idea is that Lon Chaney will be the star of the show here. Lon Chaney having spent the better part of the 1910s and 20s pioneering the field of prosthetics and special effects makeup for the film industry, where he is his own makeup artist and through his talents and skills is able to create various guises of horror and deformity that shocked and awed the nation in his work up to this point. Unfortunately, Lon Chaney dies before production can begin on Dracula. So when Lon Chaney is no longer available, the next most obvious candidate, one would think, would be to see who's playing Dracula in the touring stage play of the same adaptation of the Bram Stoker novel, and that would be one Mr. Bela Lugosi.
I am Dracula.
Unfortunately for Bela Lugosi at the time, Carl Laemmle was not interested in picking up the unnoteworthy stage actor and was instead trying to get together one of the bigger motion picture stars of the time, either John Ray or Ian Keith or William Courtenay. But in the end, Lugosi had played the role on Broadway and was touring with the company when they brought the show to Los Angeles and ended up getting the job, largely because he took a very low paycheck to have the part. And for 7 weeks of work, he earned $500 a week. But now, who is this Bela Lugosi? And where did he come from? And how did he come to play the role of such an iconic character who, in ways very similar to Iron Man, perhaps kicked off an entire franchise of various characters and crossovers for a movie studio? Bela Lugosi, surprise, surprise, is actually the stage name of Bela Ferenc Descho Blasco, a Hungarian-American actor who was born in 1882. Bela Lugosi is actually the youngest child of his family, and leaves his home at the age of 12 and begins to work a succession of manual labor jobs. We get our first record of him as a performer in his very early 20s, very small roles in sort of provincial theaters in Hungary. He adopts the stage name Bela Lugosi in honor of his birthplace Lugos. He moves to Budapest to play in the National Theatre of Hungary between 1913 and 1919, which is interrupted by a 2-year stint in the Royal 43rd Infantry Regiment of the Austro-Hungarian Army, a political body that would not survive much longer through his career. But he returns back from the war and tries to continue his acting career. So unfortunately, Bela Lugosi was a trade unionist, and when the communist revolution in Hungary failed in 1919, the reprisal from the government in power against the people who had attempted the revolution was of such violence and intensity that he decided he needed to flee the country and escaped into Germany, works in the German film industry while he can, but during this time he also has some family drama. His wife at the time miscarries and leaves him, returns home to Hungary and her parents, and files for divorce. So now with no wife, no child, Bela Lugosi decides that it is time for him to find greener pastures, and works as a crewman aboard a merchant ship across the Atlantic to make his way to America, landing in New Orleans in December 1920, eventually making his way to New York City, where if you can make it there, you can make it just about any place else. It is not until 1927 that Bela Lugosi is approached to star in the Broadway theater production of the stage play Dracula, which was adapted for the stage by Hamilton Dean and John L. Balderston. The Dean and Balderston sort of adaptation is formative for the very first film versions of Dracula for a lot of its history before folks start to take any sort of unique or creative direction from the source material themselves. Summer of 1927 begins to play the role of Dracula. In 1928, the Horace Liveright production tours the United States to fanfare and critical acclaim, and that is when the tour reaches Los Angeles, California, that Bela Lugosi decides to stay on the West Coast, where the film industry is looking for talent, and he is cast in his first official film roles. He is cast in a couple of movies: The Veiled Woman, a silent film from 1929, and a movie called Prisoners, also from 1929. Unfortunately, due to the poor storage conditions and medium of the time, a great deal of the films from this era just have been lost, are considered lost to time, whether the original films were not indexed or archived properly, or have been known to have been destroyed. There were several different instances of fires, and unfortunately, as anyone who has seen Inglourious Bastards by Quentin Tarantino will know, a certain age of film, the chemistry in the material of film is highly flammable, so the records and history of these films is sometimes only kept due to the records and financials of the projects at hand, and that's the only way we know that they were ever actually made, because there is no existing footage left. But with a couple of appearances under his belt, Bela Lugosi tries to make his film career a reality, while also trying to avoid getting typecast, which as we know from today, is already very difficult with the modern iteration of Hollywood, much less back in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when I'm sure just racism and prejudice were far more rampant and commonplace than we could even imagine now. When he finds out that a movie version of the Dracula play that he's performed in so often is in the works, he begins to kind of lobby the studio executives for the lead role, the role of Dracula. And as he said, the studio are leaning more towards a more well-known big name actor for the day. Unfortunately, the real defining factor for Bela Lugosi landing the part was the fact that he was willing to take a very, very low salary to do the job, and on a project that needed to stay under budget, that was a good enough reason for them to take a chance on the unknown but experienced Bela Lugosi.
I stumbled upon a most amazing phenomenon. Something so incredible, I mistrust my own judgment.
Compared to our modern day notion of the timeline and budget it takes to put together a movie, in these days, they were still kind of pushing the boundaries on how quick and dirty these things could get done. So on a 36-day schedule with a budget of $355,000, Todd Browning begins production on the shoot for Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, by all accounts, this is a disorganized affair with various levels of comfort in the notion of a talkie. Not all actors at this time are used to having to perform dialogue directly. The history of the role having been that more over-the-top stage-style acting was the de rigueur at the time before, but now with the advent of the sound technology added in, that is a new layer of performance to have to wrap one's head around. All in all, this is not a particularly wordy movie. There are not many lines of dialogue at all, and it is very much based on a implicit understanding of the setting and one's own pre-existing impressions of vampires as creatures of the night worth being afraid of. Ironically enough, despite the film's large commercial success, neither of the stars of the film were particularly fond of the movie and did not care to reprise their roles in the franchise as it continued on. Helen Chandler said that she did not care much about it. Quote, "It would be an awful fate, for instance, to go around being a pale little girl in a trance with her arms outstretched as in Dracula all the rest of my screen career." And when Bela Lugosi was asked to reprise his role as Dracula in another stage tour of the play, he was quoted as saying, "No, not at any price. When I'm through with this picture, I hope to never hear of Dracula again. I cannot stand it, and I do not intend that it shall possess me." Which is unfortunate turn for Mr. Lugosi. It is sort of the main thing he is remembered for. Some people might think that it would be better to have unlimited freedom on a creative project. Those in the know in the creative industries realize that there is actually a lot of value in having limitations and restrictions. One of the most formative of those being a shoestring budget. And that does lead to some incredible work by cinematographer Carl Frund, who is able to put together some really impressive play of dark and light to enhance the creep factor, set the tone. We also have sound effect design by the one and only Jack Foley. And if you don't know who Jack Foley is or why that's impressive, the name of a person who works in sound effect engineering nowadays is known as the Foley artist. So that should give you some indication of the impact that Jack Foley had on that particular practice. With the background and context behind the making of the movie, we can discuss the actual movie itself. So we begin the movie following the character Renfield, who we are introduced to as sort of a foppish gentleman of the Western world who is riding by carriage into the foothills and mountains of Transylvania because, as we find out, he has a carriage to meet at midnight to have an audience with one Count Dracula, and the folks in the village that his carriage has arrived at obviously give him the classic warnings of there are vampires in the castle, not to trust anyone. In classic movie fashion, he ignores the warnings of the good villagers and proceeds to take the carriage out to his midnight meeting, where he is picked up by a carriage with a lone, silent driver and driven to the castle of Count Dracula. As we are on the way there, we have a funny cut to Renfield leaning out of the carriage to try and communicate with the driver to ask him to slow down, only to see that instead of a driver sitting at the reins of the horses, it is instead a bat who is still doing the job of leading the carriage and directing the horses, but just while flapping his wings in place while the coach goes along. It's one of many cutaways to the little rubber bats on two thin strings that kind of crack me up the entire runtime of this movie. It is obviously, for its time, par for the course in terms of special effects, but one of the many instances of an effect not aging particularly well. But Renfield arrives at the castle. His driver, the coach driver, has vanished, and in his place is instead Count Dracula, embodied by Bela Lugosi, in the what is now trademark look of a vampire, with the slicked back black hair, the handsome face with pointed features, and very specifically the aristocratic garb, the waistcoat, the top coat, all in impeccable black and white. We do have color stills of the production that do show the lining of Count Dracula's cape, which is, of course, just fancy formal wear, is lined with a red satin lining, and that is nice. It is one of the weaknesses of a black and white film, that those little pops of color elements that would really hit home have to be either implied or directly referenced in the dialogue. There are a couple different times where characters describe Count Dracula's bright red eyes, and unfortunately we just have to use your imagination for that particular look. But Count Dracula has lured Renfield into his abode and basically takes Renfield as a prisoner after having convinced him to bring the lease for Carfax Abbey in London. Now, I'm not sure if the folks who made the website and service that tells you the history of used cars were aware that their brand name Carfax was already well established and in use in this vampire story, but someone should let them know. Anyway, it seems that Count Dracula wants to have a little London vacation, and so has prepared boxes of dirt, of his Transylvanian homeland dirt, to ride with him on ship out to London, where we are treated to a very fun cut-in of footage from a different Universal Pictures project to show part of the book of the Ocean Voyage, where we now meet Renfield as a crazed maniac madman, servant of the vampire lord, who only rambles of desiring to eat flies and spiders and other small creatures full of blood. The mad Renfield is found as the only survivor of the voyage when their ship pulls into London Harbor. I will note also that for a movie that is set in Transylvania and London, ostensibly, very little accurate accent work happening.
Rats. Rats. Thousands. Millions of them.
Renfield is sent to Dr. Seward's sanatorium. Meanwhile, Dracula prowls the London streets at night, and we actually see him going to the theater where he introduces himself to Dr. Seward, Dr. Seward's daughter Mina, Mina's fiance John Harker, and a lady that they all know called Lucy Weston. And Count Dracula makes what begins as a pretty good, just sort of like proper introduction as like a, hey, I'm your new neighbor, very nice to meet you. And then the social interaction ends with Dracula discussing death and things. It leaves a very funny impression on the young group, who then continue to discuss their encounter. Count Dracula, having become enamored with Lucy, goes to visit her in the night. And in our first view of the terror of the vampire attack, see as he uses his shape-shifting abilities to fly into the window of her bedroom and then lean in with his predatory hand claws, and then we fade away because these movies will never show an actual bite or any sort of violence like that. That would be far too risque. But Lucy Weston is then found dead later. This leads Dr. Seward to call in the aid of Professor Abraham Van Helsing, who is aware of vampires and of ways to identify and repel them, including the implementation of the plant wolfsbane, because, as we've established, despite the strong historical one-to-one vampire equals bat ties, Bram Stoker says they could also do wolf. That's still in their vampire wheelhouse as well. So Van Helsing is involved now, is on the case, as he begins to try and identify who the vampire is that's getting everyone. Wouldn't you know it, but Count Dracula himself shows up at the house and decides that Mina is going to be his next victim. So he not only bites Mina, but also gets Mina to drink some of his blood, which then makes her a thrall of his.
Dracula? Oh, what's he done to you, dear? Tell me.
He came to me. He opened the thing in his arm, and he made me drink.
And the kind of second half of the movie is this fun. Mina is a little bit of a sleeper agent in the house, trying to obey the commands of Count Dracula, while Van Helsing tries to thwart the vampire and put an end to his reign of terror. From a storytelling perspective, it is a little bit of a sloppy ending. Our Act 3 culmination of what will happen to young Mina if she will be saved by Van Helsing and John Harker, her fiance, or if she will be the new mistress and perhaps eventual wife of Count Dracula, is resolved in a very quick sequence in the final, I want to say, like 4 minutes of the hour and 10-minute runtime. That is, I think, one of the benefits is that it is a relatively well condensed version. In that condensing, though, you do lose a little bit of the sense of time and pacing to make it a more dramatic drawn. There's no tension building, and from a modern perspective, it's easy to look back at this one and say, yes, they hadn't quite figured out how to transition between scenes still. So there are some weaknesses of things that the film industry just had not yet discovered, but also some very strong strengths. The use of framing and lighting is really exceptional in a few of these shots. Very good use of sort of backdrop painting and overlaying footage of carriages and cars. for those sort of wide shots in a pre-green screen era. A very effective way of putting us in the Transylvanian mountains and then shifting us over to the foggy streets of London, and some all-time classic stills of film history, especially in the close-ups of Dracula's face, where we got some very concentrated lighting efforts to have just a single beam of light across the eyes of Bela Lugosi's very intense eyes that really give him an otherworldly look. Some interesting experiments in terms of point of view attempts with the camera work in an era where cameras are very large and unruly and kind of have to be set up on a tripod. The Dracula tries to start innovating in those departments as well, where with a very unflattering underlighting, Bela Lugosi, his mouth ready to bite, descends in on the camera as we are in the perspective of the soon-to-be victim. So for a modern audience, I would say that this one's probably not going to get much response in terms of thrills or spooks or scariness sort of writ large. But at the time, this movie was absolutely blowing people's minds and scaring the absolute daylights out of them. Now, whether or not some of these accounts were exaggerated for the purposes of marketing, it's pretty plausible to believe. We're not too far removed at this point in film history from the panic from the footage of a locomotive coming towards the camera, and some people running away in terror thinking that a train would be coming to run them over. So the audience at the time had never before been treated to such effects, and had never been treated before to a villain, a monster character who could play between the horror and terror and otherworldliness of the creature with hypnotic powers who feasts on the blood of the young, while also being able to play the debonair aristocrat, the well put together and charismatic face of a aristocratic bearing of a count. That is certainly one of the biggest lasting impacts on the character of Count Dracula, due to some of the controversy of this and subsequent horror movies from Universal Studios. It would lead to the first sort of self-censoring of the film industry in what was otherwise known as the Hays Code, in an attempt to avoid congressional regulation. The Motion Picture Production Code, otherwise known as the Hays Code, was a self-implemented set of censorship and a sort of list of things that movies promised not to include. So after the difficulties in casting and production, the film debuts, marketing is effective, and the $355,000 budget, they actually did come in about $10,000 under budget on, and netted a profit of $700,000, making it about $1 million movie back in 1931, roughly the equivalent of about $15 million today in profit. So a hugely successful project from Universal Studios, and gives them the green light to sort of go full bore into what would become the Universal Studios Monster Universe, or the Universal Classic Monsters, as we're sort of currently aware of them. The Monsters line technically dates back to 1913 with the original Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but most folks will go ahead and tell you that it was not really a thing until Dracula hit in February of 1931. That success led to Frankenstein, which would debut later that year of 1931 in November, starring Boris Karloff. And these two movies would basically cement those two names in the pantheon of great character actors, and would be followed by more iconic monster characters. The following year would be The Mummy, followed by The Invisible Man, and then our first sort of sequelization, 1935's Bride of Frankenstein. And with each of these movies, the studio is able to get the budget just a little bit higher and have now coalesced into a kind of regular group of directors, makeup people, camera people who kind of know what the tone of this monster universe is and are getting better and better with each film at pushing the envelope, pushing their abilities, and creating more and more innovations in filmmaking and in special effects. The Mummy begins pioneering different sorts of camera work where we're finally getting things off of the tripod and moving the camera around. The Invisible Man, a technical marvel for the 1930s in depicting the character invisible at all, with quite a lot of special effects there. The run of monsters would continue through the 30s and 40s. By the 1940s, Lon Chaney Jr. has joined the rotation as the Wolfman, and has now sort of rounded out our go-to list of the classic monsters. Your Dracula, your Frankenstein, your Wolfman, your Mummy, but all your classic Scooby-Doo regulars. Now, unfortunately, the late 40s and 50s, the ideas start to dry up a little, and we start to get more and more into sequels and crossovers. And then by the late 40s, early 50s, we're kind of starting to jump into comedy spin-offs, with Abbott and Costello now joining our classic monsters and kind of shifting the tone of the franchise a little bit. But there are several variations of House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and then Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, Abbott and Costello meet the Mummy. All of these kind of signaling the downturn of this once very hot commodity of a franchise. There would be one last hurrah for the Universal monsters in their original run, though, with the 1954 release of Creature from the Black Lagoon. And I did not realize there was such a gap in between Creature from the Black Lagoon and the rest of the monster crew, but it's nearly 23 years between Dracula and Creature from the Black Lagoon, which enjoys its success in large part thanks to an innovation in form, in a unique premise, in a water-based creature that creates this whole new element of how are we filming in water? How are we getting these shots? So that was the direct impact that Dracula had on its own studio, but culturally would also go on to shape the language and genre of vampire and monster movies for the rest of the world. Largely, all the sort of shorthand for vampire after this version becomes cape, slick black hair, pale complexion. Bela Lugosi it basically comes to mind, and whether it is the Count from Sesame Street or Grandpa Munster from the Munsters, all the way to the current day variations that have come on the character and the vampire lore, are all in one way or another either taking homage from or directly contrasting to the legacy of Bela Lugosi's performance as Dracula. My takeaway from having watched the film in preparation for this episode is that this is still a very effective bit of storytelling that warrants the viewing of those who wish to understand the history of storytelling and of the development of the visual language and the shorthands for horror movies. Also, an early blueprint for the now very well-known instances of creating a low-budget horror movie to great mass appeal. Thank you for joining me for this episode of 26 for 26. If you enjoyed this podcast, you should try out some of the other 321 Productions podcasts out there, which you can find at our website, 321pods.com. Shout out to the Internet Archive and the PBS YouTube channel Storied and their series Monstrum, both of which were invaluable tools for researching this episode and have great resources if you would like to dig deeper into the lore of Dracula, vampires, classic monster movies, or monster stories. So go ahead and check those out on the internet. We'll put links in the description. Thank you, and we'll catch you next time on 26 for 26.